Hello, friends. Today we are going to focus on Australia-China relationship, particularly to the context of the Australian Prime Minister's recent visit, which apparently ended on a good note. To discuss the details of this visit and also the nature of the Australia-Sino relationship after the visit, we have with us Professor Nick Bisley, from the La Trobe University in Victoria, Australia. Welcome, Professor Bisley.
Hi, great to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for sparing time. And the first question that arises in everybody's mind as to what necessitated Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to Beijing after a very tense 6-7 years.
Yeah, so Australia relations with China have been, as you said, for probably 6-7 years, about as bad as they've been since the normalization of relations. Perhaps only parallel is shortly after the Tiananmen Square incident. But I think actually the sustained duration of the diplomatic deep freeze and the essentially complete cessation of political relations between the governments really doesn't have any parallel. And so from an Australian point of view, we had gotten ourselves into a position where we effectively had a non-functional diplomatic relationship with the country that's our biggest customer and that is Asia's most important geopolitical power, at least one that's resident in the region. And so the government, I think, had taken the view that it needed to improve things. But equally, politically, the Albanese government was in a difficult position in the sense that the coalition government has always seen security relations as its strong point, and that the Labor government is potentially electorally vulnerable on that front. And so Albanese had to move fairly cautiously in defrosting the relations. He didn't want to be able to give the opposition the opportunity to kind of paint him as weak on China or soft on security or willing to sell out Australian interests. And incrementally, there's been quite a lot of, behind the scenes diplomatic interaction and a lot of give and take on both sides. But I think it's important also to stress that it wasn't just the case that Australia decided to shift its attitude towards Beijing. Beijing, I think, also had softened its rhetoric towards Australia. So, of course, China had been the precipitant of coercive trade policies on Australia. It had been very voluble in its criticism of the government, so that diplomats resident in Canberra had issued 15 talking points that Australia had to change if the relationship was to improve. And what we saw over the past, was really prior to the Albanese election in 2022, you began to see in the diplomatic representation in Canberra a shifting language and a shifting tone. That was also matched, I think, by a general shift in Beijing's outlook internationally. And I think on that front, the war in Ukraine, in a general way, helped, because I think Beijing has found itself painted in a bit of a corner by its relations with Russia. And given the domestic economic challenges that Beijing has, it probably doesn't need to be fighting with every trade partner it has, and particularly a very good trade partner like Australia. So there were a few things that lined up to get us to this point where Albanese could go. And of course, first time an Australian Prime Minister has been in China since Barack Obama was president of the United States. So it's been a long while. And so the symbolism, I think, is really very positive.
Yeah, I guess if individual countries have to take their own national security, economic interests into consideration, then I think they certainly can try to carve their way out. One other question that relates to the Western view on China, and that is the human rights situation there. Every now and then we see and read a lot on the Chinese Xinjiang province, what's happening there. But then there's the other side to it. October 7, Israel, Hamas, and then this practically unquestioned support for Israel as far as the war is going, as far as the war is concerned. Now, to what extent would you say, if at all, the Western position on Israel in the recent conflict has impacted the ideals of democracy, of the fundamental rights, human rights that it stands for?
I think it makes it, as always, it's a difficult balancing act that you have to strike between interests and values. I think Australia has always found this tricky because I think we like the rhetoric of universal human rights and liberal values. We ourselves are no paragons. We look at our treatment of our Indigenous population, for example, and we're quite happy to ignore the human rights of Timorese, West Papuans. The list is long where we see it's in our national interest to do so. And I think that's always going to make things difficult. And I think when what we are, I suspect, likely to see, and in fact, I think it was already visible, but it was probably likely to come out of the October, the conflict in Palestine, Gaza, Hamas and Israel, is going to be a greater level of kind of pragmatism in the language that's used by the US and its allies vis-a-vis China in particular. I think what we saw not that long ago from Biden, Australia was like this, Japan was like this, was framing it in very stark, ideological terms. This is a war of, so it's not a war, but this is a struggle. This is US-China. This is a struggle between democracies and autocracy. Illiberalism must be, we must stand up in the face of these, and democracy is at risk. But in a region like Asia, in which you have a huge diversity of political systems, that very stark way of presenting and framing the competition is actually not particularly politically clever, because it limits the number of countries you can operate with. And take Vietnam is the one I always think of as a classic example. This is a country that really has a set of national interests that are challenged by the PRC. But if you try to run a really hard rights-based, values-based approach to what you're doing in the region, then you can't play ball with Vietnam. You can't play ball with many of the countries in the region. So there needs to be a degree of pragmatism about it. And I think also countries, and the US principle among them, needs to learn how to figure out how it can, at the very least, be a bit more pragmatic. And if not that, then deal with the criticism of being hypocritical when it says one thing about human rights one day and something entirely different the next. But it's got experience on this. Look at the Cold War the history of the Cold War was very much America, defending human rights and liberal human values on one day and getting in bed with pretty nasty right-wing authoritarian dictatorships the next.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to point out. That would you agree that in this world of conflicts around us, it has become very difficult, at times embarrassing, for us so-called intellectuals, for you as the academic, to be talking about the human rights, about democratic rights, that they have taken a hit in view of what we have seen in the Ukraine, also in India. There's been a very critical report about the non-Hindu minorities, what's happening to them in India. And then also the latest is Israel or Palestine. So that as a whole, these notions of democratic rights and the rule of law have taken a big hit. Would you agree with that?
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, I think it is the past. It's hard to know exactly when to begin to date it, but probably the past 3 or 4 years has seen a clear decline in democracy and liberalism, liberal values, just call that more broadly, across the world generally, but particularly in our region. If you take a broad view of Asia, from Japan across to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even perhaps across to Southwest Asia to include Israel, Palestine. Across the board, you see whether it's big countries like India with really significant, curtailing of freedom of expression, attacks on the media. There's some pretty nasty sectarian, authoritarian tendencies that are being actively encouraged by some pretty influential political players in that country. You see it in Indonesia, you see it in the Philippines, although they've seemed to have ebbed a little bit. So it's, you feel as if the very first 10, 15 years of the 21st century was a period where you felt like democracy was in an expansionary phase. Each year you felt like there were more democracies, there were more elections, free and fair elections, liberal values in trade. We've seen for the past 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years, a clawing back of that, and in very significant ways and in quite worrying ways. And of course, the United States itself, you see in the political movement around Trump, some pretty serious, real attacks on democracy by a country that thinks of itself as the bastion of, the greatest defender of democracy, and it's got to look in the mirror.
Yeah, this is actually one dilemma that confronts us. I was at a lecture at one of the universities recently, and we were discussing the same issues. And then some of the students turned around and said that China, for example, has never objected to the Western models of democracy. They have not tried to interfere. I mean, as a big power, they may be doing a lot, but as the model of democracy that the Western countries pursue, China does not object to it. So why should these countries object to a system that China pursues, or for that matter, any other country? So they are talking about the national sovereign right of a nation, of a country, to pursue the model they want without harming the other nations.
Well, certainly, I think on the whole, that's true in the sense that I think China presents itself as a fairly traditional, you might call it almost old-fashioned Westphalian United Nations sovereignty true believer, that each country has a right to make its own path. No other country has a right to tell anyone else what to do. And I think that's largely true. And it's certainly, you don't see in Chinese foreign policy, even under Xi Jinping, even in its most, I think, ambitious and risk-taking, or sort of where its risk appetite has gone up, you don't see a desire to export its model. The one thing that you saw from the Soviet Union very clearly was, it wanted to export the Soviet model of politics and economy. If you sided with the Soviets, you got the full package. You've got the Soviet political system, you've got the Soviet economic model, you've got the Soviet economic support. China isn't at this stage in any way interested in exporting its model. I mean, it thinks its model is great, it thinks it works really well. It's certainly keen to export its vision of economic development and to support that through infrastructure loans and things along those lines. And we can argue the strengths and weaknesses of that. But on the sort of the other side of the ledger, though, China is certainly pretty actively involved in political interference in other countries. It's certainly keen to, and that's one of the things that set back the bilateral relationship between Australia and China, in 6-7 years ago, was when news reports brought to light various efforts, not particularly successful, it has to be said, and fairly clumsy, but nonetheless, there were very clear efforts from Beijing to influence Australian politics, to provide money to support politicians who would advance a pro-PRC line.
Thank you very much. It's a very fantastic conversation, and we hope to catch up again sometime.
Absolute pleasure. Anytime.